My name is Alara. I'm 35 years old, and 2 months ago, my wedding video hit 2 million views. But this story doesn't start with my wedding. It starts with a phone call from my mom, the kind of call where you can hear her rehearsing the words before she says them. She said, "It's better if you don't come. You'd ruin the atmosphere." She was talking about my little sister Shelby's wedding. Shelby was marrying a man named Brett Winslow at a place called Whitehaven Resort, the kind of venue where the napkins have more thread count than my bed sheets. And my mother, Diane Connolly, decided that I did not belong there. Before I tell you what happened next, please take a moment to like and subscribe. And if you'd like, share where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. I love knowing where these stories travel. Let me take you back to a Tuesday evening in March, the evening my phone rang and my mother's voice came through like a weather forecast nobody asked for. The mac and cheese was already bubbling when the phone rang. I had the oven mitt in one hand and a wooden spoon in the other, and for a moment I considered not answering. My mother had a talent for calling at the exact moment something needed my attention. "Lana, I need to talk to you about Shelby's wedding." I turned the burner down and leaned against the counter. The kitchen smelled like sharp cheddar and brown butter, comfort food for the Tuesday night kind of tired that settles into your shoulders. "Shelby's wedding is at Whitehaven Resort," she said as though announcing a diplomatic summit. "Very exclusive, limited guest list, you understand?" I didn't say anything. I'd learned years ago that silence was the fastest way to get my mother to say what she actually meant. Reed wouldn't fit in there anyway. You know how he is at nice places. Reed, my fiancé, the man who built furniture with his hands and restored sailboats that other people had given up on, the man who once drove 3 hours in a snowstorm to fix a stranger's porch railing because the stranger's wife had called his shop in tears. That Reed. "Mom, are you telling me I'm not invited? I'm telling you it's better if you don't come." There it was, not even dressed up, not even sorry. I scraped the burnt edges off the mac and cheese and stood in the kitchen trying to remember the last time my mother had asked me to be somewhere instead of asking me to stay away. I couldn't find one, not one single time. This was the pattern, and I'd been living inside it so long I'd mistaken it for wallpaper. Shell's birthday parties with matching napkins and professional photographers, mine with a store-bought cake and a card signed in my mother's handwriting that always looked rushed. Shelby's engagement announcement framed on the mantel, mine met with a 4-second silence and then, "Well, I hope you thought this through." Holiday photos on the wall where I'd been cropped out so neatly you'd think the family only had one daughter. That night, I scraped the burnt mac and cheese into the trash. Reed found me standing in the dark kitchen at midnight, and he didn't say a word. He just handed me a cup of tea and sat on the counter next to me. The thing about growing up second is that you don't always notice it happening. It creeps in sideways like humidity. You wake up one day and everything is damp and you can't remember when it started. Shelby's high school graduation. My mother hired a photographer, professional, with a reflector and a second lens. There are 47 photos from that day. I counted once. Shelby in her cap, Shelby with her friends, Shelby and Mom, cheek to cheek like an ad for maternal pride. My college graduation, 4 years later, a different school, a degree in conflict resolution that took 5 years because I worked nights. My mother forgot the date. She texted me the next day. Did I miss it? No apology, no follow-up, just a question mark that somehow felt like a period. Shell's engagement party 2 years ago, my mother flew to Florida, booked a hotel, coordinated a brunch for 30 guests. When I called her the following month to say Reed had proposed, the line went quiet for 4 seconds. I counted those too. "Well," she said, "I hope you thought this through." The hairspray smell was what I remembered most. Every special occasion in our house, my mother stood in the bathroom spraying Shell's hair into something magazine-worthy. I'd sit on the edge of the bathtub watching. She never turned the can toward me, not once. It took me a long time to understand that I wasn't the problem. My face was. I looked like my father, the man who left when I was 9, the man my mother never forgave for leaving, the man whose jaw and brow and quiet stubbornness lived on in my mirror every morning. Shelby looked like Mom, golden, photogenic, easy to display. I looked like the man who'd broken her heart, and every time she saw me, she saw him walking out the door. One night, I went digging through the garage and found a cardboard box behind the holiday decorations. Inside, every childhood photo of me that used to hang on the wall, all of them removed from their frames, stacked face down, edges soft with moisture. Shelby's photos were still on the mantel, dust-free, backlit. I put the box back. Some evidence doesn't need a courtroom. It just needs you to finally stop pretending you didn't see it. Reed's workshop sat at the end of a gravel road that bent along the river, past a stand of birch trees and a mailbox that hadn't matched the house in years. The building was old, a converted boathouse with a tin roof that had gone from red to rust and back again. Inside, it smelled like linseed oil and sawdust and the particular warmth of wood that's been worked by hand. When I drove out there the day after the phone call, Reed was sanding the hull of a 1942 sailboat he'd been restoring for 8 months. The boat was oak and cedar, bruised by decades of neglect, and he was bringing it back the way he brought everything back, slowly with his hands, one layer at a time. He'd named her Second Wind. I sat on an overturned crate and told him what my mother said. He didn't stop sanding, the rhythm of it. Long, even strokes was the only sound between us for a while. "Your mom's not the worst person I know," he said finally. "She's just the most afraid. I'd never thought of it that way. Afraid of me? Of what I represented? Of a life that didn't look like the one she'd rehearsed?" We talked about our wedding. We'd been planning it loosely, small, here at the workshop. Nothing fancy. Reed had offered to build the tables himself. I'd been collecting wildflower seeds from Margot Tillman's garden next door. We didn't have a budget spreadsheet or a coordinator. We had a river and good light and 100 people who knew our names. Lana, I wasn't invited to Thanksgiving either. I stopped keeping count in year 2. He said it the way he said most things, without bitterness, without performance, just fact, like reading the weather. I watched him go back to sanding. The hole was starting to gleam where he'd stripped the old varnish. Underneath all that damage, the wood was still good. It just needed someone patient enough to find it. Shelby called 2 days later, and I knew it was coming. The way you know rain is coming when the air gets thick. "Lana, hi, I heard Mom talk to you." Her voice was honey poured over something sharp. I could hear ice clinking in a glass on her end. Mid-afternoon cocktail, which for Shelby was practically a personality trait. She did. "I just want you to know it wasn't my idea." A pause calibrated. "I told her you should come." "Did you?" "Of course, but you know how she is." And honestly, another clink of ice. Mom has a point. Brett's family is very polished. And Reed, no offense, he'd probably show up in work boots. Reed owned exactly 1 pair of dress shoes. He'd bought them for my company holiday party 3 years ago and polished them himself. But Shelby didn't know that because Shelby had never been to anything we'd invited her to. "We could do a girls' lunch after," she offered, her voice lifting at the edges. "Just us, my treat." That was Shelby's signature move, the consolation prize disguised as generosity, a brunch you didn't ask for to replace an event you were excluded from. She'd been doing it since we were kids. Break my crayons, then offer me one of her markers. Always the wrong color. "I appreciate the call, Shelby." "Of course. I just didn't want you to think I don't—" A beat, then. "Okay, love you." I hung up, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel sad about my sister. I felt something sharper. Not anger, that would come later and leave quickly, the way summer storms do. This was quieter, cleaner, clarity. I'd spent 34 years translating my family's behavior into something I could live with. Mom doesn't mean it that way. Shelby is just stressed. They love me. They just show it differently. I was fluent in that language. I could conjugate every excuse. But sitting there in my kitchen, phone still warm in my hand, I realized I was done translating. The words meant exactly what they said. You'd ruin the atmosphere. He'd show up in work boots. My treat. Some conversations end with a goodbye. This one ended with a period I'd been too polite to place for 3 decades. The next Saturday morning, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a roll of brown craft paper. Reed's radio was playing jazz from the workshop, just close enough to hear the bass line through the open window. I uncapped a blue pen and started writing names. Not a guest list, a gratitude list. Margot Tillman, my neighbor who'd been bringing soup to our door every time I got sick for 7 years. Not because I asked, because she noticed. Dave and Elena Parker, my colleagues who helped me move apartments at midnight when a pipe burst in my old building.
Elena showed up with packing tape and her daughter's wagon, and Dave carried my bookshelf down 3 flights of stairs without complaining once. Coach Barnett, my high school softball coach, who drove 4 hours once to watch me receive a mediation certification award that nobody in my family attended. He sat in the back row and clapped like I'd won a championship. Mrs. Haydex, my 10th grade English teacher, who wrote, "You have a voice, use it," on my final essay. I found her on social media 6 years ago, and we'd been exchanging birthday cards ever since. Reed added his names. There was Frank, a retired shipwright, who taught him dovetail joints when he was 19. There was the Kimura family, whose fishing boat Reed had repaired at cost after a storm nearly sank their livelihood. There was Janet, his first client, who still came by every spring with homemade jam. By noon, we had 120 names. Every one of them could tell you a story about why they were on that paper. There were no obligation invites, no business contacts, no people we met once said out a thing, just hands that held ours when things got heavy. Reed looked at the list and said, 120 people. Every one of them showed up when it mattered. I picked up the pen again. At the bottom of the craft paper, I wrote one more name, my mother's, and I circled it. Reed saw it. He didn't say anything. He just refilled my coffee and went back to the workshop. Some invitations are offered with both hands open. You extend them knowing full well they might be handed back. Shelby's wedding was on a Saturday in April. I know because Instagram told me, and because my mother had posted a countdown that began 45 days prior. I spent the morning in my garden, turning the soil in the raised beds Reed had built from reclaimed dockwood. The dirt was cool and damp from overnight rain, and there was something deliberately grounding about pushing my hands into the earth while my sister said her vows to a man I'd met twice. By afternoon, the photos started flooding my feed. White Haven Resort draped in white organza, 300 guests seated in rows of gilded chairs, an ice sculpture, a live string quartet, Shelby in a gown that probably cost more than my car, smiling, a smile I knew was rehearsed because I'd watched her practice it in the bathroom mirror since she was 12. I scrolled through the photos the way you drive past a house you used to live in, curious but not homesick. I recognized maybe 40 people in the crowd. The rest were strangers, Brett's business partners, my mother's social circle, people whose names appeared on place cards but not in anyone's phone on a Tuesday at 2 a.m. when things fell apart. That evening, my Aunt Patricia called. Patricia was my mother's younger sister and the only member of the family who still treated me like I existed on purpose. "I wish you were here, honey," she said. Her voice was low, like she'd stepped into a hallway to make the call. "Your mother is performing." I could hear the reception behind her. Laughter, clinking, the muffled thump of a DJ playing something with too much bass. "Are you okay?" she asked. "I'm good, Aunt Patricia, really. Good, because I'm eating shrimp that costs $14 a piece and I can't taste a thing. This party has no soul." I thanked her. I meant it. Then I put the phone down and went back to the garden. The soil was warm now, and the tomato seedlings I'd planted that morning were already standing straighter. That evening, Shelby posted a video of her first dance. 500 hearts, 20 comments from people I'd never heard of, and 1 comment from Mom, my perfect girl. I closed the app. In 6 weeks, it would be my turn, and I wasn't going to perform for anyone. I made my mother's invitation by hand, craft paper like the guest list. I wrote her name in blue ink, folded a sprig of dried lavender inside, and sealed it with wax from a candle Margot had given me. It was a kind of invitation that asked nothing except your presence. Reed watched me address the envelope. "You sure?" he said. "She's my mother." "I know. That's why I'm asking." I mailed it on a Monday. By Thursday, I'd already stopped expecting a response. Not because I'd given up, but because I'd been managing my mother's silences for so long that I'd learned to breathe through them. She called on Friday. I was washing dishes. I dried my hands on my jeans and picked up. "A boat workshop?" She said it the way you'd say a crime scene, flat, horrified. "You want me to sit on a dock and watch you marry that carpenter? He's a restoration craftsman, Mom, and yes, there'll be a chair with your name on it. Lana, be realistic. This isn't a wedding. It's ours." She paused. I could hear her recalibrating, the way she always did when someone didn't follow the script she'd written in her head. "I'll think about it," she said. In my mother's vocabulary, "I'll think about it" had never once preceded yes. It was a polite no, the kind she could later point to and say, "I considered it." 3 days later, the invitation came back in the mail. The envelope was unopened. On the front, in my mother's firm, practiced handwriting, "Return to sender." No note, no explanation, just those 3 words in the same blue ink I'd used for her name, as if she'd chosen the color on purpose. I stood at the mailbox for a long time. The lavender sprig had slipped out through a tear in the corner, dried and fragile, clinging to the flap. I pressed the lavender between the pages of my grandmother's cookbook, the one Diane threw away after Grandma passed, and I rescued from the curb before the garbage truck came. The binding was cracked, and the pages smelled like vanilla and flour, and it held recipes for every kind of love my grandmother believed in. Some things you keep, not because they're yours, but because someone should remember they existed. The transformation started on a Saturday in May, 5 weeks before the wedding. Reed sent out a text to his network. No group chat, no mass email, just individual messages that said, "We're getting the workshop ready. Bring whatever you've got." They showed up with everything. Dave Parker arrived first with a truck bed full of reclaimed dock planks and a circular saw. He spent the afternoon building a dance floor on the concrete pad where Reed usually stored whole timber. By sundown, it was level and smooth and smelled like fresh-cut cedar. Margot came with her vintage lace curtains from 1978, the ones she'd used at her own wedding, folded in tissue paper all these years. She draped them across the workshop's open bay doors so they'd catch the river breeze. The lace was yellowed and delicate, and it turned the afternoon light into something that belonged in a painting. Elena Parker strung twinkle lights along the rafters using a ladder she'd borrowed from her daughter's school. Her 12-year-old Lucy helped thread mason jars with wildflowers, lavender and baby's breath, and white daisies from Margot's garden. Reed's friend from the marina, a man named Hank, who spoke mostly in nods, welded a custom arch from salvaged iron railing and set it at the bow of the restored sailboat. It was rough and imperfect and absolutely beautiful. By the end of the first weekend, the workshop looked like a place that had been waiting for this. String lights reflected on the river surface at dusk. The tin roof, which usually sounded like a drum in the rain, now framed the sky like a cathedral ceiling. Total cost, $3,800. Food would be potluck. Music would come from a speaker playing Reed's playlist. The cake, lemon pound cake from a recipe that belonged to Reed's mother, Martha, would be baked by Martha herself. Margot stood back and looked at what we'd built. She tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear and said, "It looks like a place where real things happen." She was right, and real things don't need a guest list of 300 to prove they matter. My mother never could leave well enough alone. 2 weeks after her returned invitation, Aunt Patricia called with the kind of voice you use when you're trying not to sound alarmed. "Honey, I need to tell you something. Your mother's been calling people." "What people?" "Family, extended family." She told Uncle Frank, "You're having some kind of breakdown." She told Cousin Denise the workshop wedding is, her words, a cry for help. The washing machine was running behind me, thumping its steady rhythm. Domestic normalcy has a sound, and it's the sound of a spin cycle while your mother dismantles your reputation one phone call at a time. She called Reed's mother too, Patricia added, quieter now. That stopped me. She told Martha that Reed isn't, how did she put it, stable enough to support a wife, something about his business failing. Reed's business had never failed. It had come close once 3 years ago when a supplier went under and he lost 2 months of materials. He'd worked double shifts, taken on repair jobs he didn't love, and rebuilt. The workshop was still standing. So was he. That evening, Uncle Frank called. Frank was my mother's younger brother, a quiet, practical man who fixed furnaces for a living and had a lie detector that worked at professional grade. "Your mom called," he said, skipping the pleasantries. "She says you're not doing well. That true?" "I'm fine, Uncle Frank. I'm getting married in a workshop on the river with 120 people who actually know me." A long pause then. "Your mother has always been creative with the truth." He didn't say more, but I heard it. The click of a man moving his allegiance from one column to another. That night, Reed came home quieter than usual. He hung his jacket on the hook by the door, washed his hands at the kitchen sink, and stood there with the water running longer than he needed to. "Your mother called mine," he said. "I know. Whatever she said, I don't want to repeat it." He turned off the faucet. "She's trying to undo things before they happen. I didn't ask what things. I already knew." My mother wasn't trying to stop a wedding. She was trying to stop me from building a life that proved hers was built on sand. Martha Gallagher drove 3 hours from upstate on the Wednesday morning without calling ahead. She showed up in our driveway in a dusty sedan with a cooler in the back seat and a look on her face that said she'd already made up her mind about something. "I wanted to see the workshop," she said, hugging me at the door. "My son talks about it like it's a church." Martha was 63, wide-shouldered and practical in a way that made you trust her within 5 minutes. Her husband had died when Reed was 16, and she'd raised 3 boys alone on a librarian salary and a garden that never quit. She had calluses on her palms and opinions she didn't bother softening. I drove her to the workshop. She stood in the open bay doors, looking out at the river, the string lights, the dance floor Dave had built, the sailboat with its fresh varnish glowing in the afternoon light. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then she walked to the front row of chairs, found the one with Margot's name on it, and nodded.
This is the most honest wedding I've ever seen. We sat on the dock with iced tea, and I told her everything. The phone call, the returned invitation, the calls to family. "Your mother called me," Martha said, told me Reed wasn't ready. My stomach dropped. "I'm sorry." "Don't be." I told her, "My son has been building things since he was 12. He built a birdhouse for me when he was 13 that still hasn't fallen apart. He'll build you a good life." She took a sip of tea, and I told her that if she had concerns about my son, she was welcome to come see his work in person. She hung up. Before she left the next morning, Martha had already started a test batch of her lemon pound cake in my kitchen. The whole house smelled like lemon zest and butter, and she'd written notes in the margin of my grandmother's cookbook. Adjustments for altitude, a trick with cold butter, a small drawing of a heart next to the ingredient list. On the drive home, she texted, "Save me a seat next to that lady with the vintage lace curtains. She sounds like my kind of people." Nina Reeves showed up at the workshop by accident.
She was 27, a reporter for the regional newspaper, and she was writing a series called Small Businesses That Survived, profiles of local shops and workshops that had weathered the last decade without folding. Reed's Boatyard was on her list because he'd been featured 2 years ago in a brief mention when the town council voted to preserve the waterfront. She arrived on a Thursday with a camera bag and a notepad, expecting to photograph sailboat hulls and talk about supply chains. Instead, she found string lights in the rafters and mason jars of wildflowers on every flat surface. "Are you getting married in here?" she asked, looking up at the lace curtains catching light. "Next month," I said. I was sorting name cards at the long table near the door. Nina's eyes went to the sailboat, then to the dance floor, then to the clothesline I'd strung between 2 oak trees outside the bay doors. We'd be asking guests to write notes and hang them there during the reception. "Can I ask about the wedding for the piece? This is..." She looked around again.
"This is a better story than boat restoration." I told her the short version, getting married here because this was where we built our life. 120 people, every one of them hand-picked by memory. Potluck dinner, homemade cake. She asked if she could bring a video camera on the day. Light setup, no disruption, just a few minutes of the ceremony and the venue. I said yes, not because I wanted publicity, but because Nina looked at the workshop the same way Margot had, like she was seeing something she'd forgotten existed. "This is going to be a good story," she said, packing her camera. I thought she meant the business profile. She'd already moved past that, but I didn't know it yet, and that was probably for the best. If I'd known what her camera would set in motion, I might have said no, or I might not have. It's hard to say. Some things are meant to be seen by more than 120 people. The flash from Nina's camera bounced off the hull of Second Wind and filled the workshop with warm gold light for a single second. Then it was gone, and the afternoon went on. The cracks in Shelby's perfect wedding arrived by way of Aunt Patricia, who had a gift for delivering bad news the way a doctor delivers a diagnosis, calmly, with just enough detail to make you pay attention. "Shelby and Brett had a fight," Patricia said, at the reception, publicly. I was sitting on the workshop dock, feet dangling above the water. Rain was starting, soft, the kind that taps the tin roof in a rhythm you could almost set a clock to. Brett's mother cornered Diane at the dessert table, Patricia continued. She said, and I am paraphrasing because her exact words were worse, "I don't know half the people here. Who are these people?" It turned out that half of Shelby's 300 guests were Diane's additions, her book club, her church friends, her hairdresser's family, people Shelby had never met, people who were there because Diane wanted an audience for the production she'd been planning for 2 years. Shelby lost it. She pulled Diane into the bridal suite and screamed at her. "You invited your entire book club. This was supposed to be my day." And Diane said, "I paid for half of this. I can invite who I want." I closed my eyes. The rain was steady now, drumming on the tin roof above me, and for a moment, it sounded like applause for something nobody was proud of. "It was like watching 2 mirrors reflect each other's vanity," Patricia said. Neither of them could see past their own reflection long enough to notice the other one was doing the exact same thing. I didn't feel triumph. That was the strange part. I thought I might, a small, guilty spark of satisfaction. But sitting there, with the rain on the river and Patricia's voice in my ear, all I felt was sad. Sad for Shelby, who traded authenticity for spectacle and was surprised when the spectacle broke. Sad for Diane,
who couldn't stop performing long enough to realize the audience didn't care. Your mother and your sister are more alike than either of them will ever admit, Patricia said. I didn't disagree, but I also didn't feel like celebrating someone else's cracks.
I had my own house to build, and it was going to hold because the people inside it were real. You know, standing here in this story, I keep thinking about all those names on my guest list, 120 people, and every single one of them could tell you a story about why they were there. If you're still listening, I want to ask, have you ever made a guest list not by obligation, but by gratitude? Drop a comment. And if this story is hitting home, that subscribe button is right there. There's a tradition most mothers dream about, taking their daughter to find a wedding dress, champagne and mirrors and tears, and the moment the right dress makes everything quiet. I didn't call Diane, I called Margot. We went to a little vintage shop downtown, the kind of place where the dresses hang on wooden hangers and the air smells like camphor and old vanilla. Margot wore her reading glasses on a chain around her neck and carried a handkerchief in her cardigan pocket, which told me she'd already decided she was going to cry.
I tried 3 dresses. The first was too much, beading and tulle that felt like wearing someone else's ambition. The second was too simple, a slip that didn't hold any shape. The third was ivory tea-length with lace at the wrists and a neckline that sat just below the collarbone. It looked like something my grandmother might have worn in a photograph from a time when weddings were smaller and the cake was baked by someone who loved you. "Oh," Margot said, just that one syllable, with her hand pressed flat against her chest. She stood up from her chair and walked over. Her hands were shaking slightly as she buttoned the back, small pearl buttons that took patience. She buttoned them one at a time, the way you do when you know the moment matters and you don't want to rush through it. "I buttoned my daughter's dress 30 years ago," she said quietly. "I never thought I'd get to do this again." Margot's daughter lived overseas. They hadn't spoken in years, for reasons Margot kept folded as carefully as the lace curtains she'd saved from her own wedding.
I didn't ask. Some silences are someone else's to break. I looked at myself in the mirror. No professional makeup artist, no photographer, no mother standing behind me, adjusting the veil and whispering about how beautiful I looked. Just me, Margot, a 100-year-old mirror with a chip in the corner, and a dress that fit like it had been waiting in that shop for exactly this moment. The tears came then, not for the dress, not for the wedding, for my grandmother who died 8 years ago and who would have sat in that shop chair and wept without apology. She would have said, "That's my girl," and she would have meant it. Margot adjusted the lace at my wrist and said, "You look like someone who figured out what matters." Diane came to my house on a Wednesday afternoon, 3 weeks before the wedding. She didn't call first, she didn't text. She just appeared on the porch the way she appeared at everything, uninvited and fully prepared. She was carrying a photo album, leather-bound, gold trim, the kind you buy when you want the container to be more impressive than the contents.
"I've been thinking," she said, standing in my doorway with the album pressed against her chest like a shield. "Maybe it's not too late to do this properly." Do what properly? The wedding, a real venue, a real guest list. She stepped inside without being asked. "I can help plan." She set the album on the kitchen table and opened it to a page of Shelby's wedding. Professional shots, filtered and glossy, every face in perfect lighting. "This is what a wedding should look like," she said. "I know people. I can get Whitehaven for a weeknight at a discount." I leaned against the counter and let her talk. It was her preferred mode, monologue disguised as conversation. She went on about caterers and color schemes and guest counts, and I realized what she was actually doing. She wasn't offering help, she was offering control. The same control she'd exercised over Shelby's wedding and was now extending to mine like a franchise. "Mom," I said, "this wedding is planned. Every chair has a name. But none of those people are family, Lana."
I looked at her. She was standing in the kitchen that Reed and I had painted together beneath the shelf he'd built for my grandmother's cookbook, next to the window where I could see Margot's garden in full bloom. "All of them are family," I said, "just not yours." Her face changed. Not anger, something rarer, something that looked like fear. The kind that comes when you realize you've been excluded from something you assumed would always be yours. She left without finishing her coffee. The photo album stayed on the table. I opened it that night. Every page was Shelby. Shelby and Brett, Shelby and Mom, the extended family, the resort, the ice sculpture, 300 faces. But there were gaps, Pages where photos had been removed, slots with those little white triangular corners holding nothing. Every single photo of me pulled out systematically, completely. I closed the album and put it in the garage, next to the box, next to everything else she'd erased. 2 weeks before the wedding, I walked through the workshop alone at twilight. The string lights were up, powered by an extension cord Reed had run from the main panel. They cast warm circles on the ceiling beams and reflected off the river outside like scattered coins. The wildflowers in their mason jars had been refreshed that morning. Elena's daughter, Lucy, was taking it personally, showing up every other day with new cuttings from Margot's garden. The dance floor was sealed and smooth. The clothesline for guest notes hung between the 2 oaks outside the bay doors, wooden clips waiting in a row. The sailboat's second wind stood at the far end of the workshop, freshly varnished and gleaming, and Reed had built a small platform at its bow where we'd say our vows. I walked between the rows of chairs, reading the name cards, everyone handwritten in the same blue ink I'd used on the guest list. Margot Tillman, front row, left side, next to Martha Gallagher. 2 women who didn't owe me a thing, who decided to show up anyway. 2 women who mothered differently than the one I'd been given, and mothered better for it. Uncle Frank, 3rd row. He'd RSVP'd with a phone call. I'll be there. Tell me where to park. Coach Barnett, 4th row, driving 4 hours again, because that's what Coach Barnett did. And then the empty chair, front row, right side. The name card read simply, Mom. I stood there staring at it. Part of me wanted to remove it, fold up the chair, recycle the card, reclaim the space for someone who would actually use it. Part of me knew that wasn't why it was there. Reed found me standing over it. He'd come in through the side door, sawdust still on his shoulders. Leave it, he said. Not for her, for you, so you know you didn't close the door. I left the chair, and on the name card, under Mom, I didn't write a last name. I didn't write a plea. I just left it as it was. The simplest, most honest thing I could offer. Outside, fireflies were starting to blink near the waterline. The river was dark and smooth. The string lights hummed, and somewhere in that quiet, the workshop stopped being a venue and started being a promise. The rehearsal dinner was a potluck. There was no ballroom, no assigned seating, no printed menu with 3 courses and a wine pairing. There was cornbread from Margot, dense and golden, still warm in a cast-iron skillet. There was Martha's test batch of lemon pound cake, which she insisted wasn't final, but which everyone ate 2 slices of anyway. There was a tray of tamales from Elena's mother-in-law and a slow cooker of pulled pork from Hank, who brought it without explanation and left before anyone could ask for the recipe. We ate outside, on the dock. No microphone, no stage. When people wanted to speak, they just stood up from wherever they were sitting and said what they came to say. Dave Parker spoke first. Lana once mediated a dispute between 2 co-workers who hadn't spoken in 6 months.
By the time she was done, they were sharing lunch. That's who she is. She fixes things. Coach Barnett raised his glass of sweet tea. I coached Lana when she was 14. She wasn't the fastest, she wasn't the strongest, but she was the kid who carried the equipment for the kids who couldn't. Every single practice. Janet, Reed's first client, stood up with her hands in her jacket pockets. Reed repaired my husband's sailboat the year my husband passed. He didn't charge me. He came back 3 times to make sure it was right. That's the man your daughter is marrying. She looked at the empty chair and then looked away. Reed's toast was the last. He stood where the dock meets the grass, river behind him, one hand in his pocket. Lana is the first person who ever looked at my workshop and didn't see a mess, he said. She saw a home. The cornbread was gone. The citronella candles were guttering. The river was making its soft sound against the pilings. And somewhere upstream, a bullfrog was doing his best to compete with the conversation. I didn't give a speech. I squeezed Reed's hand under the table and mouthed thank you to the room. It was enough. Sometimes the best thing you can say is nothing, because the people who matter already know. That night, my phone buzzed. A text from Shelby. I heard about your workshop wedding. Cute. I read it twice. The period at the end said more than the words. The morning of my wedding, I woke before dawn. The house was quiet. Reed was already gone. He texted at 5 a.m. At the shop, last things. He had a habit of needing to touch every surface before an event, like a pilot walking around the aircraft before takeoff. I let him have it. I made coffee and stood at the kitchen window. The sky was turning from black to gray to the palest blue, the kind of morning that doesn't make promises. June light in this part of the country has a quality, soft but honest. It doesn't hide anything. Margot arrived at 7 carrying a bouquet she'd assembled from her garden at dawn. Lavender, baby's breath, white daisies, and 1 stem of rosemary because she said, "It's for remembrance. Your grandmother would want to be here." She helped me into the dress, the pearl buttons up the back, one at a time.
Her hands were steady this time. She'd practiced on the dress form at the vintage shop, she admitted later. She wanted to get it right. "You know," she said, fastening the last button, "I buttoned my own daughter's dress 30 years ago. Different dress, different century." A pause. "She looked beautiful. You look real." I didn't correct her. Real was better. I looked in the mirror. No professional makeup, just mascara, lip balm, and the flush you get from a cup of strong coffee in a morning that matters. The dress sat right. The lace at my wrists caught the light from the window. I looked like myself, which was the only person I'd ever wanted to look like on this day. Diane didn't call, didn't text. The phone sat on the bathroom counter, silent and certain. I'd left room for it. A pause in the morning where a mother's voice should have been, telling me I was beautiful, asking if I was nervous, fussing with my hair the way mothers do. That pause came and went, and I let it. Margot handed me the bouquet, lavender and rosemary, and the smallest white daisies I'd ever seen. "Ready?" she asked. I nodded, and I meant it in a way I hadn't meant anything in years. Not ready as in prepared, ready as in finished waiting. Finished rehearsing someone else's version of this day, ready to walk into my own. The workshop was full. 120 people filled the rows of chairs that Reed and Dave had arranged in a gentle curve facing the sailboat. The bay doors were open to the river, and a breeze was coming through that carried the smell of water and warm wood and wildflowers. Margot's lace curtains moved like breath. There was no aisle walk with a father, no one giving me away, because I wasn't something to be given. I walked in alone through the side door, the way I'd been entering Reed's workshop for 3 years, like I belonged there. Reed was standing at the bow of Second Wind. He'd put on a white button-down and the 1 pair of dress shoes he owned, polished again that morning. His hands were clasped in front of him, and when he saw me, he didn't cry. He just nodded once, the way you do when something you built finally holds weight. Our vows were short. I'd written mine on a card, but I didn't need it. "You never asked me to be someone else," I said. "You never edited me. You never cropped me out. You just handed me a cup of tea and sat next to me in the dark." Reed cleared his throat. "Lana, you taught me that a house without people in it is just lumber, and a boat without a name is just a hole." I heard Margot crying before I saw her, a quiet, dignified sound from the front row. Martha had her hand on Margot's arm, and Martha was crying too, which I'd never seen before, and which Reed later said was a historic event. Uncle Frank clapped first. He was 3 rows back, and he clapped the way he did everything, firmly, like he meant it. Like the sound itself was a decision. The ceremony lasted 22 minutes. No ice sculpture, no orchestra, no 300 strangers whose names I couldn't remember. Just 120 people who knew us, and 1 empty chair in the front row that said more than any speech. Nina Reeves was filming from the left side of the workshop, her camera resting on a tripod near the tool bench. Quiet, unobtrusive. I'd forgotten she was there. I wouldn't forget for long. The reception spilled out of the workshop and onto the dock like something that couldn't be contained. Potluck plates covered every table. Margot's cornbread again, she'd made a double batch. Elena's caprese salad, Hank's pulled pork, a slow cooker of chili from someone I couldn't identify until Coach Barnett raised his hand, embarrassed. "My ex-wife's recipe," he said. "It's the only good thing I got in the divorce." Reed's playlist came through a speaker propped against the workshop wall. Acoustic guitar, vintage soul, the kind of music that fills space without pushing conversation out. People danced on Dave's cedar floor. Martha and Margot sat together in the front row of chairs that nobody had bothered to rearrange, sharing a slice of lemon cake and talking like they'd known each other for decades. The clothesline was the thing I hadn't expected. I'd strung it between the two oaks as an afterthought. Wooden clips, blank cards, a couple of pens. Write something, hang it up, or don't. No pressure. By 9 o'clock, the line was full. I walked along it, reading under the string lights. Thank you for being the neighbor who shoveled my driveway every winter. Margot. You saved my job when no one else would listen. Elena. You fixed my daughter's bookshelf and wouldn't take a dime. Sarah K. I flew 4 hours because some drives are worth making twice. Coach B. Every card was a receipt for something real. Not grand gestures, not Instagram moments. Just the small, accumulating evidence of 2 lives lived in genuine connection. One card near the end of the line was written in handwriting I didn't recognize.
I don't know the bride or groom. I'm a +1, but I wish every wedding felt like this. I stood on the dock at 9 p.m. and looked out at the river. The water was black glass. Somewhere upstream, Whitehaven Resort was hosting someone else's performance. Here on this dock, with potluck plates and handwritten notes and a husband who smelled like sawdust and lemon cake, I had everything I'd been told I didn't deserve. I want to pause here for a second. That clothesline of notes, each one handwritten by someone who showed up. I didn't ask for speeches. I didn't hire a coordinator. People just wrote what they felt. If you've made it this far in the story, you're one of my people too. Hit like, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and let's keep going. 3 days after the wedding, my phone rang while I was unpacking gifts in the kitchen. It was Nina. So, she said, in the way journalists say so when they're about to tell you something that will change the scale of your week.
The article went live this morning. It's called The Workshop Wedding, a celebration built by hand. That's nice, I said, setting a mixing bowl on the counter. It has a 4-minute video. Ceremony, the venue, the notes on the clothesline, the sunset. A beat. It's at 50,000 views. I sat down. 50,000? My editor wants me to pitch it to regional outlets. Lana, this thing has legs. By noon, it was at 100,000. I watched the number climb on my phone like a thermometer. No one had asked me to check. Comments started pouring in. This is what a real wedding looks like. I've been to weddings that cost 10 times this and felt nothing. Who was supposed to sit in that empty chair? The empty chair. They'd seen it. Nina's camera had lingered on it for 3 seconds, just long enough for the name card to be readable, just long enough for the absence to land. By evening, 200,000 people I'd never met were sharing clips of our vows, of the clothesline notes, of the moment the river caught the last light and the workshop turned gold.
They weren't sharing a wedding. They were sharing something they recognized, a hunger for the real in a world that had been feeding them the curated. I didn't know how to feel. I'd spent a month building something small and honest, and now the internet was doing what the internet does, turning intimacy into content, tenderness into traffic. It wasn't wrong, it just wasn't planned. Reed came in from the workshop around 10, saw me staring at my phone, and leaned over my shoulder. How many? 400,000. He kissed the top of my head. Your wedding is more popular than you are. I laughed, but somewhere in my chest, a knot was forming because I knew who would see it next. I knew the algorithm doesn't care about privacy, and I knew that somewhere in a house that smelled like Chanel No. 5 and performance, my mother was about to watch her excluded daughter become visible to 2 million strangers. By day 4, the video had crossed 2 million views.
It was picked up by 3 lifestyle blogs. A women's Facebook group with 800,000 members shared it with the caption, "This is what weddings should be." A radio host in North Carolina mentioned it during her morning show, The Workshop Bride, they started calling me, which was a title I hadn't auditioned for. The story everyone latched onto wasn't the venue or the vows or the potluck dinner. It was the chair. Bride leaves empty chair from mother who refused to come. That was the headline that spread fastest, not the one Nina wrote. Nina's piece was careful, respectful, contextual, but the internet doesn't do context. It does headlines, and that headline hit a nerve so deep it might as well have been a root canal.
My phone became something I avoided. Interview requests from morning shows, messages from strangers, emails from wedding magazines wanting to feature the anti-wedding. I declined most of them. I hadn't built that day as a brand, I'd built it as a boundary. But one comment stopped me. It was buried in the Facebook thread, posted by a woman named Grace, 52 years old. Profile photo of a dog and a sunset. My mom did the same thing to me. 15 years ago, she told me my fiancé wasn't good enough. She didn't come to my wedding. We had 40 guests in a backyard. No video, no article, nobody saw. Seeing your chair made me feel less crazy. Thank you. I read it 4 times. Then I read the replies, hundreds of them. Women in their 40s, 50s, 60s sharing the same story in different words. Excluded from weddings, holidays, family events. Told they weren't enough, told they'd ruin the atmosphere. 2 million people had watched my wedding, and the thing they remembered most wasn't the dress or the vows or the sunset over the river. It was an empty chair, a single piece of furniture holding nothing but the weight of a question nobody wanted to answer. Why wasn't she there? Sometimes the loudest thing in a room is what's missing. Shelby texted first. 5 words, no punctuation. Mom saw the video. Cute. No congratulations.
No beautiful ceremony. Just a status update, delivered with the emotional range of a voicemail from your dentist. Then Uncle Frank called. His voice was different this time. Not cautious, not careful, but thick with something I couldn't name. Your mother watched it 3 times, he said. She called me after the 2nd time. She was crying. Lana, actually crying. I sat on the edge of the bed. The clock on the nightstand was ticking, which I'd never noticed before. She keeps saying, I was supposed to be there. That was my chair, Frank continued. And I told her, I said, Diane, it was always your chair. You chose not to sit in it. He paused. She didn't argue. That might be the first time in 40 years. The phone rang again 20 minutes later, my mother's name on the screen. I answered on the 4th ring, which was 2 rings more than I used to need and 2 rings fewer than I almost let it go. Why did you put a chair for me? Her voice was cracked, stripped of the performance I'd been listening to for 34 years.
Underneath it was something smaller, older, younger. The voice of a woman who'd spent so long controlling the stage that she'd forgotten how to speak without a script. Because I wanted you there, Mom. I always wanted you there. I just stopped begging. Silence. The clock ticked. Rain started outside, soft and uncertain. Those people in the video, she said, they really came for you? Every one of them. Another silence, longer this time. And then, just before she hung up, before the click and the dead air and the return to the quiet of my bedroom, I heard something I hadn't heard from my mother in decades. A sob. Not theatrical, not performed for an audience, not the kind she'd produced at Shelby's wedding for the photographer. A real, ugly, involuntary sound that she couldn't control and didn't try to. I put the phone down. Reed was standing in the doorway holding 2 cups of tea. She cried, I said. He sat next to me. Neither of us spoke. Some things don't need words. They need time. And time was something I was finally willing to give on my terms. 2 days later, Aunt Patricia told me Diane had read the full article. Nina had done something I hadn't expected. She'd listed the connection between every guest and the couple. Not all 120, just the ones who'd agreed to be quoted. But it was enough. A column of names and reasons printed alongside the video, like captions at a museum. Mrs. Margot Tillman, neighbor, brought soup during every illness for 7 years. Dave and Elena Parker, colleagues, helped Lana move apartments at midnight during a flood. Coach Barnett, high school softball coach, drove 4 hours to attend. Janet, first client of Reed's workshop, attended the wedding of the man who repaired her late husband's boat. Patricia said Diane read each entry the way you read an indictment, slowly, carefully, with the growing understanding that every line was evidence of something she'd missed. Not evidence of wealth, not evidence of status, evidence of showing up,
of soup at the door, of midnight moves, of drives that took 4 hours, of debts paid in cake and carpentry, and the simple act of knowing someone's name. Diane called Shelby afterward. Patricia overheard the start of it. "Did you read the article?" Diane asked. Shella's answer, "So what? She got lucky with a video. Our wedding was 10 times bigger." Bigger. Not better. Not more loving. Not more honest. Bigger. A word that measures square footage, but not substance. A word that counts heads, but not hearts. Patricia said Diane went quiet after that. Not the strategic quiet she deployed when she was planning her next move, a different quiet. The kind that happens when something you've been building your whole life gets measured against something built with hands and lemon cake and $3,800, and your thing comes up short.
I don't know what happened in my mother's head that night. I wasn't there. Patricia wasn't there. Nobody was there. Just Diane, alone in her living room with a laptop full of strangers who knew her daughter better than she did. And for the first time, according to Patricia, who heard this from Frank, who heard it from Diane herself, she didn't reach for the phone to manage the narrative. She didn't call anyone to explain. She didn't spin. She just sat there, learning what it felt like to be the one on the outside. The letter arrived on a Thursday, 1 week after the video hit 2 million. Plain envelope, my mother's handwriting on the front, but different from the return to sender that had come back weeks earlier. That handwriting had been firm, decisive, a door closing. This was shakier. The letters leaned slightly, as though they had been written by a hand that wasn't sure it deserved to hold the pen. I opened it at the kitchen table, with a cup of coffee I didn't drink.
I watched the video 7 times. That was the first line. No greeting, no preamble, just the fact of it, laid down like a first step on unfamiliar ground. Each time, I saw something new. The third time, I noticed the lemon cake and remembered you told me Reed's mother baked. I never met her. The 5th time, I saw the notes on the clothesline and read every one they showed on camera. The 6th time, I looked at the chairs and tried to count the people I recognized. I found 6 out of 120. 6. A pause in the writing. I could see where the pen had lifted and set back down, leaving a small dot of ink. The 7th time, I just looked at the chair. 4 more lines, each one shorter than the last. I don't know how to fix this. I'm not sure I know how, but I know the chair was real, and I know I should have been in it. No, I'm sorry. No, I love you. No explanation for the years of cropping, the returned invitation, the phone calls to family, the album with my photos removed.
Just this, an admission that the chair existed, that it was meant for her, and that she should have been sitting in it. It was the closest my mother had ever come to honesty, and it was written in a handwriting I'd never seen from her before. Uncertain, human, small. I read the letter 3 times. Then I put it in my grandmother's cookbook, between the page for peach cobbler and the pressed lavender from the invitation she'd sent back. I didn't write back, not because I didn't want to, but because some doors need to stay open without being pushed. If she walks through, it has to be her own feet carrying her. 3 months after the wedding, the video was at 3.2 million views, and I'd stopped counting. Life had returned to the shape it was supposed to be. Reed was back in the workshop, sanding and measuring and talking to lumber the way some men talk to dogs, with patience, affection, and low expectations of being understood. The sawdust was back.
The smell of linseed oil was back. The rhythm of hammer, sand, measure was back. My mediation practice had picked up. Not because of the video, or not directly, but a few clients mentioned it when they called. "I saw your wedding," one woman said during intake. "I figured if you could handle that, you could handle my landlord." I didn't argue with the logic. Margot and Martha had become friends. Real friends. The kind who call each other on Tuesday afternoons for no reason. Martha drove down once a month, and they'd sit on Margot's porch drinking sweet tea and talking about things I wasn't privy to. "Your 2 mothers," Reed called them. I didn't correct him. Shelby? Silence. Complete and total.
She hadn't called since the cute text. She hadn't commented on the video. She existed in the space between the story and the sequel. Present, unresolved, but not yet ready to enter the room. I didn't chase. Some people need to come to the door on their own.
And pushing only makes them lock it. Diane, one text message 2 weeks ago. 5 words that had taken her 61 years to type. Martha's lemon cake recipe. Could you ask her? I stared at it for a long time. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an olive branch. It was something smaller and maybe braver. An acknowledgement that Martha existed, that Martha's recipe existed, that my world contained things she didn't have access to. And she was, for the first time, asking instead of demanding. I forwarded the message to Martha. She sent the recipe within the hour, along with a note. Tell her the trick is cold butter. Reed finished restoring Second Wind that week. He launched her on a Sunday afternoon. Margot and Martha sat on the dock, watching the boat slide into the water, white sails catching the wind for the first time in 60 years. Beautiful, Margot said. She wasn't looking at the boat.
I was making peach cobbler on a Saturday when the cookbook fell open to the wrong page. Or the right one. The binding was cracked. It always had been. Ever since I'd rescued it from the curb 8 years ago, the morning after my grandmother's apartment was cleared out and my mother decided the cookbook was clutter. I'd carried it home in a grocery bag, wiped the water damage off the cover, and kept it on the kitchen shelf ever since. It fell open to the page between peach cobbler and apple crumble, the page where I'd pressed the dried lavender from the returned invitation. And next to the lavender, Diane's letter, folded twice, tucked in like a bookmark. I looked at the page beneath them, my grandmother's handwriting, faded but legible, in the margin next to the cobbler recipe, for when company comes and you want them to stay.
She'd written that instruction the way she wrote everything, practically, as though hospitality were a recipe itself. Peel the peaches, butter the pan, make them feel welcome, make them want to stay. My grandmother had understood something about gathering that my mother never learned. You don't invite people to impress them. You invite them because the table is better with them at it. I looked at the cookbook in my hands, its layers visible like geological strata. Grandma's recipes written in pencil and faded ink, my pressed lavender, Martha's lemon cake adjustments scribbled in blue pen during her visit, Diane's letter folded small and resting between pages. 4 women's handwriting in one book. 3 of them had showed up. One was still finding her way. I started peeling peaches, the kitchen filled with the smell of sugar and butter and fruit that was better for having been bruised a little before it was baked. I called Margot. Come over tonight. Bring nothing. I set the table for 4. Reed, Margot, Martha, who happened to be visiting that weekend, and me. When the cobbler was done, I cut 5 pieces. I set the 5th on a small plate and left it on the counter next to the cookbook. Old habits, I guess. Or hope? One of those. I went back to the workshop one evening in September, 3 months after the wedding and long after anyone had asked about the video. The string lights were still up. Reed had left them because he liked the way they looked at night and because taking them down felt like admitting something was over. The wildflowers had dried in their mason jars, petals curled and brown, still beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they've served their purpose and aren't pretending otherwise.
The chairs had been stacked against the wall, all except one. It was still there. Front row, right side. The name card was weathered now. Wayne had gotten to it through the bay doors one night, but the word was still legible. Mom, written in blue ink, unsigned. I sat in it. The river was moving slowly, the way it always does in September, when the summer heat breaks and the water remembers how to take its time. Through the open doors, I could see the dock, the birch trees, the mailbox that still didn't match the house. I could see our kitchen window lit up, and Reed moving behind it, making dinner the way he made everything, carefully, without rushing, with the quiet confidence of a man who trusts the process. My mother said I'd ruin the atmosphere, but the truth is, I just created my own. I just sat where she was supposed to sit and looked at the world through the frame she would have seen. The river, the lights, the boat, the name cards blowing slightly in the evening air. The life her daughter had built without her permission. Then I stood up,
I left the chair where it was. I didn't take the name card. I didn't fold the chair or stack it with the others. I just left it, facing the river, facing the open doors, facing the evening. Some chairs stay empty, not as punishment, not as invitation, just as proof that there was always room. I walked back to the house. Reed had the windows open. Margot's lavender was blooming along the path, purple and sharp and alive. And the kitchen light was on, warm, steady, the kind of light you can see from a long way off, the kind that says, "Come home. Thank you for staying until the end."